Okay, so different types of microorganisms. So we're kind of, we've just been saying microorganisms, just blanket term for things that are tiny and observable under the microscope. But there are different types of microorganisms. Bacteria are kind of like the most well-known, that we think about more, but there are different types. And so first we'll talk about how there are two major groups of cell types. So in general, if a cell has a nucleus or not, helps identify like, okay, is this kind of cell or this kind of cell? So a prokaryote is an organism that is, we can also call them prokaryotic, a prokaryotic cell type we will refer to as a prokaryote. And so these are organisms whose cell structures don't include a membrane-bound nucleus. Let's see if I can draw this really quick. We're going to talk about this in way more detail on in next week's lecture. But so if this is a cell, there's for sure a cell membrane separating the outside versus the inside of the cell. But maybe it's genetic information is kind of just in a central region. It's not in its own little compartment known as a nucleus. So if a cell doesn't have a nucleus, then it's referred to as a prokaryote. It's a prokaryotic cell. But if this cell does have a nucleus and its genetic information is in there, then that is a eukaryote. So a eukaryote is an organism made up of one or more cells. So it could just be one, it could be more than that, based on the organism. But it does have a nucleus and other organelles. And so that's what makes that a eukaryote or a eukaryotic cell. So yeah, we'll talk more about those and different cell structures next week. But so microbes include organisms from both. So there are some prokaryotic microbes and there's some eukaryotic microbes. And so prokaryotes include the domain bacteria and archaea. And then eukaryotes is just domain eukarya. So the microbes that are in bacteria and archaea, yeah, they're going to be prokaryotes. And then microbes that are in domain eukarya are eukaryotes. And so I'm going to give examples of microbes from each domain. So again, organisms within domains archaea and bacteria are all prokaryotes, and organisms in domain eukarya are eukaryotes. And there are microorganisms found in each of the three domains. So first we'll break down some organisms that are prokaryotic. And so again, prokaryotic microorganisms will include bacteria and archaea. And so I just wanted to show that I structure certain slides with this kind of like list format to help, again, show how concepts are related to each other. So this is the Roman numeral 1. And so this is the first category we're going to break down. So prokaryotic microorganisms, and within this like big group heading, I'm going to talk about bacteria, and that's why it's A, and then archaea B. So bacteria are prokaryotic because, again, their genetic material, their DNA, is not housed inside a true nucleus. And so a lot of science uses similar like prefixes, like the word part at the beginning, the word base and then like suffixes, parts of the word at the end. So pro means pre or before, and then karyote means nucleus. So prokaryote literally means pre-nucleus. It's an organism that was around before cells developed organelles like a nucleus. So anyway, bacteria are prokaryotic because they don't have the nucleus. And most bacteria have cell walls that contain this molecule called peptidoglycan. And these help protect the cells from like the environment, from each other, things like that, the host if they're inside of a human. And some bacteria are pathogens. Again, microbes can have so much variety and differences. So not all microbes are bad. Not all bacteria are bad. Some are beneficial. And some bacteria are pathogens. And so pathogen means a disease-causing microorganism. So some bacteria are pathogens, but not all of them. Some are beneficial. Bacteria are single-celled, so one cell is one organism, and they replicate by this process called binary fission that we'll talk about later in the semester. So basically, it's one cell, and then it divides into two cells, and that's how they reproduce. Common shapes of bacteria include like spherical, so spherical meaning looks like a sphere. It's just like round. They could be rod shaped, and though that shape we call bacillus. Or they could be curved, and there's different like ways that they can be curved, but let me just give like a simple example of like a little spiral. And so this is a Coccus, Bacillus, and Spirillus. And that is singular. So if you're just talking about one bacteria, it's Coccus. If you're talking about more than one, plural, it's Cocci, Bacilli, and then Spirilli. So this is singular. Come on. Singular. And then this is plural. And those are the three general like shape types. So again, that's why I'm saying it's not like you could just look at a round one and say, oh, this is E. coli or whatever, because there might be other ones with that specific type. So they have a wide range of metabolic capabilities and can grow in a variety of environments using different combinations of nutrients. And so that's a lot more helpful to be able to identify and categorize bacteria. So yeah, for energy, bacteria can use organic or inorganic chemicals. And this process is called chemosynthesis, is like using chemicals to make energy. Chemo, chemical. Synthesis is like to make. So that's how you make your energy, is from chemicals. So again, this could be organic or inorganic, using carbon or not. Or some bacteria use solar energy, and they can do photosynthesis. And so, yeah, they can create their own energy from light. So there's a lot of different varieties of bacteria. And so here's some more examples of the different shapes. So like I said, if you're just talking about one, it's Coccus. Spherical. Bacillus is like rod shaped. And then here are different curved ones. So category B in prokaryotic microbes is archaea. So these are also single-celled, so unicellular prokaryotes, but they're very different in their genetics, in their metabolic pathways. Back in the day, we used to just lump them together, like, oh, they're tiny, they're probably both bacteria. But we learned more about them, and so we refined that knowledge, and okay, we need to make a whole new group. This is going to be archaea, and that's going to be bacteria. So they're, similar-ish, but they're very different in genetics, metabolic pathways, etc. Their cells do not have a cell wall made of peptidoglycan. And they're super interesting in that they are found nearly in every habitat on Earth, even extreme environments. So super extreme environments that are very cold, very hot, very basic, very acidic, deep springs in the ocean. So they're found everywhere. You just don't hear about them that much. But it's really interesting that none of them are known to cause disease. I don't know why. They just haven't. And so here's an example of somewhere you can find them. Again, they mostly live in extreme environments. So in this hot spring at Yellowstone National Park, the color differences in this pool are a result from the different communities of the microbes that live at these different water temperatures. Because like up here is going to be a different temperature than further down there. And so there are different organisms there that end up all together making different colors. Okay, so that was category, Roman numeral 1, prokaryotic organisms. Category 2, like a huge category, is the eukaryotic microorganisms. So domain eukarya includes all eukaryotes, and within that group there's a lot of different ones. But the main 4 kingdoms within domain eukarya are protists, fungi, plants, and animals. And so we'll give examples of organisms that are in protists, fungi, and helminths. So eukaryotes can be unicellular. There are some eukaryotes that are just one single cell, one organism. There are eukaryotes that are multicellular, like us, for example. We are made of like a bajillion cells. So the main defining characteristic of eukaryotes, again, is that their cells contain a nucleus. And so U actually means true. So a true nucleus is what eukaryotes mean. So there are eukaryotic microorganisms within protists, fungi, and animals, and they're going to be called helminths. So again, these are different subcategories of eukaryotic microorganisms. So first we'll talk about protists. So protists are an informal grouping of eukaryotes that are not plants, animals, or fungi. So the way we organize eukaryotes is based on how they get their energy, how many cells they have. And so it's really easy to sort stuff into plants, animals, or fungi. But protists are kind of just like a miscellaneous group. They're just like a hodgepodge, informal grouping of things that are eukaryotes, but they don't really meet the qualifications of things to be put into those other categories, like plants, animals, or fungi. So protists are kind of, just like a mixed group. So protist microorganisms include algae and protozoa. And I should have put like a subcategory. So like 1 for algae and 2 for protozoa. So think about adding that maybe. So first we'll talk about algae as a protist. So algae use photosynthesis. First of all, they are eukaryotes, right? Their cells have a nucleus. And so they use photosynthesis to extract energy from the sun. And in doing that process, they also release oxygen and carbohydrates into their environment. And their cell walls have a molecule called cellulose. So they can be like plant-like, because they do photosynthesis, but they don't meet those requirements, and so that's why they're lumped into protists. But algae can do photosynthesis, and they have cellulose cell walls. And so if you've heard of diatoms or diatomaceous earth, those are a kind of algae. And so here's an example of some that live in the sea ice in Antarctica. And so diatoms, yeah, are a kind of algae. And again, if you were to look, they do have a nucleus. And so they are categorized as microorganisms because they're really tiny. You need a microscope to look at this. This was taken with a microscope. And then another category of protists that are microorganisms are protozoa. So these may be modal, and modal means like able to move on their own. So they have like tiny structures that are able to help them swim and things like that. So if you think of like an amoeba, that kind of fits under this category. So protozoa may be modal, able to move on their own due to different structures. Some are photosynthetic, but others feed on organic material. Some are free living, but others are parasitic. And they may reproduce sexually or asexually. So protozoa, again, is kind of just like a weird mix, and they have these qualities. They go into this category. And again, they're very tiny, and so that's why they are considered microorganisms. You need a microscope to be able to view them. So here's an example of Giardia lamblia, and so this is a protozoan that makes people sick. So you might have heard maybe about people getting Giardia. So this infects humans and other mammals, causing severe diarrhea, but it is a eukaryote because it has a nucleus. And so it's not a bacteria, it's a protozoa. Okay, so both of those, again, if I go back, those categories were in protists. They're eukaryotes, but they're not plants, animals, or fungi. So we talked about algae and protozoa. And so now to category B of eukaryotes that are microorganisms, fungi. So fungi can be unicellular or they can be multicellular. They're eukaryotic. They typically have cell walls, but it's made out of different stuff than bacteria or algae. Their cell walls are made out of a molecule called chitin, and they lack photosynthetic pigments, vascular tissues, and organs. So they're not plants, even though at one point scientists thought they were plants. Again, you learn more and you refine how you categorize things. So they're eukaryotic. They have cell walls, but it's not made out of the same stuff as plants. They don't have photosynthetic pigments, vascular tissues, organs. So again, that's kind of why they have their own group. They use organic chemicals for energy. And they can reproduce by either like asexual reproduction, by just like budding. So like kind of just budding off, or sexual reproduction, like spores, like mold and spores. So fungi is this term for the bigger group. It can be unicellular or multicellular, but there are different kinds of fungi. So a yeast is any unicellular fungus. So if it's just one cell as one organism, then it's referred to as a yeast. So again, baker's yeast is a fungi. And if something is a multicellular fungus, it's referred to as a mold. And typically mold is made of long filaments. So yeast, again, there's baker's yeast, like Saccharomyces cerevisiae, but there's other types of yeast, groups. So this is an example, Candida albicans. And usually this is the species of yeast that causes vaginal yeast infections as well as oral thrush, which is a yeast infection but of the mouth. Usually that affects infants. And so again, just because you look at a microorganism's shape doesn't mean that you know what it is just based on the shape. You have to like know more about, okay, how do the cells grow together? What are the other things about this? Like, does it do this kind of metabolism or this? So it has a look that is similar to Cox's bacteria, but it's not a bacteria. It's different. Yeast is eukaryotic. And there is a nucleus. It's this like darker blue area right here. So yeah, microorganisms can vary a lot in how they look, but there's even more that helps you tell them apart. So morphology means like how they look. So it has a look that's similar to that of Cox's bacteria, but it's not. And then again, molds have multicellular fungi. So large colonies of microscopic fungi can be seen with the naked eye, usually, as example, on the surface of these moldy oranges. So this is fungi for sure, and it's mold because it's multicellular and you can even see it visually. Okay, and so category C of eukaryotic microorganisms are helminths. So helminths are animals. They fall under kingdom Animalia. But we don't want to just lump the whole kingdom Animalia because it's only really this group that we can include in microorganisms. Helminths. So these are multicellular parasitic worms. And typically they're really large in their adult form, so you don't really need a microscope to see the adult form. But the eggs and larvae are microscopic, and so those you do need a microscope to be able to see. And so that's why they're considered a microorganism, because part of its life cycle is microscopic. So here are some helminths. So this is the beef tapeworm. This needs to be in italics, my bad. Tania saginata. And that can infect both cattle and humans from undercooked steak and beef. The eggs are microscopic, but the adult worms, are able to be seen with the naked eye. But the eggs are microscopic, and so that's why you can't just like visually tell if the eggs are in the beef that you're cooking, and that's why you have to cook it to a certain temperature and a certain length of time to kill the eggs and not catch this. And here on the right is another kind of helminth. It's the guinea worm. And again, the adult version is huge. You can see it, but the eggs are tiny and microscopic. So some of those can cause disease because they're affecting body parts. So those are the eukaryotic microorganisms, protists, fungi, and helminths. And so we're going to talk about another category of microorganisms that don't fall under either prokaryotic or eukaryotic. And those are viruses. So viruses are interesting. They're super interesting, but they are acellular, meaning that they're not actually made of cells. So even though we kind of show them like this, we show them as a circle and it has stuff inside and stuff on the surface, and maybe that's kind of similar to how we make pictures of cells, but they are not made of cells. They're not made of the same stuff that cells are made of. They can't even live on their own. So a virus is really only like proteins. So this circle is just a protein-like shell. And then there's proteins on the surface sticking out. And then on the inside is either DNA or RNA. So there's some kind of genetic material, but there's not all the other stuff that makes a cell a cell. So even though we picture them and they maybe look like the same things that we depict cells as, they're not really cells. They can't replicate on their own. They are considered inert outside of a host organism. Like they can't do anything on their own. To make more viruses, viruses need to first just happen to get into your body and then happen to get into your cell. And then your cell will basically be tricked into making more copies of this virus. So they can't do anything on their own, really. They're just almost like particles. They're just molecules and particles. But if they do happen to make their way into your body and your cells, they can be pathogenic and make people sick. Yeah, so viruses are not really alive, they're not made of cells. Even though we kind of describe them as like doing things, like evolving or infecting people, they're not doing anything. They're really just around and they happen to get into cells and happen to make people sick. So here are some examples of different viruses. So this is members of the coronavirus shown under microscope. And cells are so tiny. They're tiny, tiny. They're even tinier than bacteria. So you need a whole different kind of microscope to be able to view them. They're so tiny, which is more evidence that they're kind of just stuff. They're just like molecules almost. So here they are viewed under a different kind of microscope. And then here is another example on the right of an Ebola virus. So again, viruses are not bacteria. We tend to kind of lump bacteria and viruses together as germs that could make people sick, but they are not the same thing. Viruses are not alive. They don't have actual cells. Yeah. We'll talk a lot more in detail about that on its own lecture, but just to do an overview again of microorganisms, microbes. Okay. So, all those things are different microorganisms. They're things that are alive or affect life that need to be viewed with a microscope. And so microbiology is a broad term that encompasses the study of all different types of microorganisms from any of those categories. So microbiology is like an umbrella term, this overall field, but there are different like subfields. So bacteriology is just studying bacteria. Even though nobody really says like, oh, they're a bacteriologist, you kind of just say microbiologist. But yeah, technically bacteriology is just studying the bacteria. Mycology, anybody that studies and is a mycologist, studies fungi. Protozoology studies protozoa. Parasitology studies just the parasite like animals, like helminths. Virologists study viruses. And then even though it's not studying like a specific type of microorganism, immunology also kind of includes these things because you're studying how the human body reacts and fights off any of these things. So yeah, microbiology is a huge field and there's a ton of different like subfields. Even within bacteriology, like any of the units and lectures that we cover can be its own field. Like somebody might only study like the metabolism of bacteria. Somebody might only study the genetics of bacteria. Some might only study how some organisms are able to move on their own. So yeah, microbiology is a huge field. And this course, of course, is going to really cover clinical applications and the clinical focus. But just know that like it's a huge field because there's so much to learn and so much we still need to learn. And so this semester, you're gonna, learn how to be a microbiologist.